Namaskar. Welcome to this episode of Up Close with Upward. We've been articulating the need for a civilizational discourse at Upward, and we've done our bit in trying to get some nuances right. But more than just the thought behind what the civilizational discourse should be, and what the constituents of that discourse would be, there is a massive need for people to work on it and implement it. And that's also something that we've been talking about. Today, our guest is someone who's actually got his hands dirty, and he's trying to infuse the governance structures and the policy of this country with the civilizational ethos, the dharmic ethos of this land. We have Mr. Raghav Krishna with us, and I've been lucky to have interacted with him several times in my personal capacity, and I've come out always richer and more informed about a lot of things that we've discussed. And so it's a great opportunity for all of us to learn from what he's doing at the Rashtraam School of Public Policy. He's the Associate Dean and the co-founder of the institution. And so I hope that this interaction will benefit all the viewers of Upward. Welcome to the show, Raghav. And before we start discussing what the civilizational discourse is and how the policy of the country is informed by that or is not right now, and how you come into the picture, tell us a little bit about what you do at Rashtraam.
Sure. Thanks, Ashish. Thank you for having me, and it's fantastic to be amongst friends. And since there is no promise of erudition from my side that the Upward audience would fall for, so I think you and I can have a conversation about things that matter to us. And I'll talk about the journey that I've gone through, my own personal journey, and why over a period of time I've developed the moral conviction in the discourse that you've also been championing. And also the point that you mentioned about not just people working on it in a specific way, but also the relevance of institutional transmission mechanisms. So when I think about Rashtraam and my work at Rashtraam, it's fundamentally how do you create a place where this becomes a thing to be taught, learned, and then lived. Right? Of course, you're doing a great job through the media advocacy. There are a lot of other players in the ecosystem who are all doing their parts, and my own personal sort of reflection on the civilizational discourse has led me to believe that you also need an academic institution to advance this discourse, and that's how I look at my work at Rashtraam. But it did not begin with Rashtraam. Rashtraam is just a sort of culmination of what I've been through in the last 4 or 5 years, and maybe before that, and I consider in part this to be my penance for not having done this earlier. So you mentioned 2 key terms, public policy. Although Rashtraam intends to take the discourse from public policy analysis, because the public policy discourse in India today, I think largely in the world, gets more analytical, and you look at certain structural elements and you hope that elements are according to your theory. At Rashtraam, we intend to take the discourse from public policy to public leadership. Ultimately, all discourse around institutions leads to people, and Rashtraam is an investment in people to develop the leadership potential in them, and to give them the ability to be self-aware and also be civilizationally assured. And I would like to explain what I mean by civilizationally assured during the course of our conversation.
Right. So, I mean, interesting that you mentioned that this was a penance of sorts for you. What is your individual motivation behind?
So I am. I was like any other liberal or beneficiary of a post-liberalized India. I began my career in the IT industry and then moved to a creative product development industry, and I worked in game development for a decade and a half. And at a certain point in time, because you have intellectual curiosity, you start thinking about questions that are bigger than you, and it could also attribute that to more time at office. But what has happened with me personally, and I don't think it's distinct, I personally know a lot of friends who've gone through this, is because the culture today pushes you to have an opinion, and it is incessant. You cannot really escape the discourse even if you think you are. And a lot of opinion that I saw floating around was not really informed by any deep study. and that sort of started gnawing at me, I felt that I need to have a more authentic answer for myself, and the questions are essentially about what is India's place in the world. You interact in a multinational corporation, you're interacting with people from all over the world, and you see a sense of confidence that people from other parts of the world are able to represent themselves with, and you also sense then an acute lack of that in your own culture. And there are all sorts of theories given to you, right, around why that is so. There is the economic dimension, there is also the social dimension, so you're given certain clues, but none of them lead you to what looks like truth. So at a certain point, let's say around 2015, the questions became too big for me, and I felt like I need to go beyond just engaging in a superficial discourse and acting as if I understand this, to making an honest attempt at unpacking it for myself. So, like everyone else, I looked to institutions for answers, and the first sort of entry was, okay, there is a political problem in India, and that political problem is leading to ill-formed and ill-conceived and ill-designed policies. So, if you are able to get your public policy right, you can make an impact in India, and an India where state actions, essentially public policy, is examination and a recommendation of state actions. So if you are able to get that right, you're likely to have a better India. Right? I engage with that and I still do. Public policy forms a lot of my reading even today. But over a period of 2 years, as I started thinking about public policy and the discourse around public policy, if you will, I realized that public policy itself is also beholden to a certain institutional culture. Then I wanted to understand how do institutions, what sort of culture comes to inhabit institutions, and why is that so? That led me to a little bit of a brush with political philosophy, right? You understand that an institution that is espousing an idea or a value, it comes from a school of thought, and that school of thought emerges from a historical context, and we are all aware of why that is different and why that is ill-placed sometimes in India. So you get to political philosophy, you understand that there is a certain worldview that people espouse through the political philosophy, and then you interrogate that further. Are we just political animals? Is that our fundamental identity? Is the human story just a story about rights and contest of power? And then you slowly get into metaphysics, and you start understanding that the public policy, which is derived from a political philosophy, and political philosophy is then also sort of coming from a certain view of the idea of man itself and man's relationship with nature. So you start examining certain ethical constructs from different worldviews and how they've conceived of man. Having done that, I had a full circle come back, and I realized that the metaphysics of what I'm understanding to be the source of political philosophy that determines public policy in India is very different from what my culture has taught me. Right? And I realized that we are actually in India, in that sense, we are all born schizophrenics. There is a certain idea that the discourse gives you, and there is a certain lived experience that is almost entirely different from that. And I think this is violence. This is epistemic violence. This is actually, we talk about stunted growth in terms of physical attributes, but I think there is a significant and a systemic mental subjugation of growth in India. Then I had my first real brush with what we call Indic knowledge systems about a couple of years ago. All of us are aware of these things, but to actually study that as a structured system of knowledge and to understand, just to even get a glimpse of why it is organized the way it is organized, and why that system holds the most sophisticated and the most fertile ground for solving what we consider to be mainstream political public policy problems. This has been my journey. My journey about trying to answer some questions for myself and looking at different avenues, going through public policy to political philosophy to then finally looking at the Indian metaphysics and the system of knowledge. So where I am today and why I am at Rastram is essentially to rediscover the art of teaching. The fundamental questions that I am concerned about are how do we learn, how do we remember, how do we pass that knowledge on. And it's not a personal pursuit alone, and I think it has civilizational scale relevance, because ultimately what would any decent society want to have? You would want to have a structure where you're able to take care of your elders, make sure that you are benefited from the wisdom that they've gained, make sure that you produce something of value, and you're able to offer to your next generations. In that sense, this is not really an altruistic activity that I'm engaged in. I'm doing this because I have an 11-year-old daughter. And I've come to agree with Thomas Sowell when he says that the travesty of our times is that we seem to have traded what works for what sounds good. And personally, I do not want my daughter to fall for what sounds good. I want her to have the critical reasoning to examine the ideas that are given to her by the discourse. And to do that, there are certain faculties that you need to develop. And that is where learning comes in. That is where institutionalized understanding of a systemic structure of knowledge, which your civilization has given you, becomes relevant. It's a deeply personal question that determines which school your kid will go to. And that's what I'm attempting to answer.
So obviously you've done a lot of hard work in coming to this, to the kind of understanding that you have right now, or at least in terms of your personal, your personal life and your personal view. The clarity that you've gained is not something that, that is easy to attain without significant struggle. I'm not saying that I'm not giving this as a compliment. I'm just describing the whole process.
Sure.
Now, when at Rashtraam, when you produce alumni and you're producing leaders for tomorrow, this whole process, do you think it is possible to transfer it in an institutional way? I would think, my understanding is that you would rather devise heuristics and share with your batches so that they are able to internalize it without going through the whole process that you've personally gone through, right? So how does that work?
Oh, thanks for that. I think the question allows me to talk a little bit about the learning design at Rashtraam. And fundamentally, this is it is possible because we are all beneficiaries of that system. The Indic knowledge system, once you start understanding it as a structure of knowledge, always had within it this mechanism to transfer. Right? What is the greatest technology that that I can think of? It is that a culture has managed to transmit its ideas in its entirety completely orally. How did that happen? How do we still have the same Vedic chants that you hear in the temples every day, going back to thousands of years? So if a culture managed to create mechanisms, it means that it understood something very, very fundamental about who we are. And this is what makes the Indian culture different, and why there should be a genuine claim for Indian exceptionalism and Indian expansionism, is because it is about knowledge and refinement of the individual itself. So at Rashtraam, the learning design is based on the research that the Indic corpus has already produced around developing certain key faculties or intelligences in any human being. It's heuristics, but it's beyond heuristics as well. The heuristics is the outer layer. There is an inner refinement process that informs the heuristics that you pick, right? And if you remember David Foster Wallace's famous valedictory speech, and he talks about the vacuum of liberal arts education in India and in the West, sorry, and he talks about how it has become almost didactic, and liberal arts education does not tell you what to think about. When we refer to critical thinking in the Western understanding today, it tells you how to analyze critically. It gives you a superficial sort of sense of being able to objectively analyze different paradigms, and it gives you a certain method. But it does not refine you internally to tell you from a drishti what you should be thinking about, right? Which is where the Indian knowledge system differs, and the intelligences that we are talking about are at 4 or 5 levels, right? Fundamentally, and this is amazing once you think about it this way. You do not have a system of education today that gives you physical intelligence. The real truth that all of us experience, beyond all the discourse that all of us are engaged in, is the pain in our knees and the voice in our head. That's the truth that all of us can experience, right? So which means that you need to have a certain way of understanding your physical structure. So there was a lot of emphasis in the Indian education system around your physical structure. You go to Ayurveda, you look at yoga. All these systems were preparing you for a larger introspection of life, but starting with the thing that you know the best. So there is an element of physical intelligence. Then of course there is the dimension of what goes as emotional intelligence, but I would prefer the term yogic psychology if you have to, It is also about the mental structures and the impressions and the whole theory of Panchakosha that we have. And combining these two things, you create a base, a physical intelligence and an emotional core, which is able to then look at certain issues. So you need to then develop the cognitive dimension. So which means you need to think about the logic of argumentation. If you look at a school like Nyaya, or if you look at the rich tradition of argumentation in the Indian culture, Vada, Samvada, you understand the sheer intensity of our ancestors in their pursuit of truth. We get away saying a lot of things today because the culture incentivizes and monetizes that. That was not the case in a culture that was very, very particular about truth. So we want to bring back some of that respect into discourse. Ultimately, what we call public policy is nothing but the ideas that get discussed and the ideas that get purchased with people. So and you therefore need to find ways of improving public discourse, and therefore the dimension of cognitive intelligence to pierce through an argument, to understand what is being told, but layered and supported by the emotional intelligence. Right? We speak of empathy as a value, and almost every educational institution, to every politician also today talks about empathy. But you don't need to be empathetic about certain about people that you already like. You need to be empathetic with people who are opposed to you. Right? And to do that, you first need to discover that root of that unease within you. Is it jealousy? Is it anxiety? Is it envy? Do you have the intelligence and the humility to summon and reflect what is that emotion that you're going through when you're in an interaction? If you're able to do that, then empathy is an outcome of that. You cannot impose empathy as a value, right? So these sort of, so when you say how do you transmit these systems, the knowledge system already has it. We are just the beneficiaries of this knowledge structure, which has given us this ability to develop physical, emotional, cognitive, interpersonal dimensions of human life, but all of it grounded in a spiritual core. It is because there is this idea of transcendent, possible transcendence for each of us, and that is really the only equality that is possible if you think about it that way. Because that is available to you, then it gives you a tremendous upside potential for human life, and then your culture sort of reduces the downside risk. So this is what we would want to transmit, and there are certain mechanisms for this. There is a certain flow that we've curated, and the course itself goes in this flow. Okay. So you first start grounded with what is called Ritachit, or the idea of integrality and interconnectedness of systems. And I'll tell you why this is super critical for public policy. Public policy today does not account for intergenerational outcomes of political actions, because your political cycles are obviously short, and your public memory is even shorter. You are incentivized to optimize for the short term, whereas the problems of such individual actions which are optimized for the short time piling up lead to not just borrowing from the future, but actually actively killing the future. Right? So the discourse that we are given about how we are progressing and how there's never been a better time for humanity, if you follow Pinker, if you follow Rosling, we should take that with a little bit of skepticism. Because public policy has always shown us that when you optimize too much for the short term, the second order consequences of that in the, let's say, in the 20, 30, 40 year cycles are devastating. Right. So when we think about this fundamental human development and public leadership, it is that ability to see interconnectedness of actions across time and space. And this is done through a study of what we call Ritachit. What is the cosmology, and how do you derive a socio-political design from the cosmology? And this is what the Indian tradition was always about. So the big problems, and I'm getting into, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself with the questions that might come later, but if you think about the big problems of sustainability today, it is fundamentally, in my opinion, because you've got your cosmology wrong.
Right, right. No, so the fact that we are having this conversation is due to, the elephant in the room, which is that there was a disruption in this transmission of the dharmic knowledge systems, and we all know where that came from and why that happened. And today we live in a globalized world where these values are often, or some of these systems are often appropriated and using Mr. Rajiv Malhotra's terminology, digested. Yeah. And then presented as their own, in the West, they present it as their own ideas, and which is fine, but that's not the point that I'm making. What I want to ask you is, given that we live in a globalized world where these ideas are not mainstream, right? And the ideas themselves, even though they are profound and have a have a potentially huge benefit for the planet itself, why is it, I mean, how do you cope with the fact that these ideas, in spite of their potency, they were they declined and our civilizational decline happened, and now that we are rethinking about these, how do you bring that back to the glory where it was and where it should be, right? So what is your response to the challenges, or do you even acknowledge those challenges of, let's say, in Sam Huntington's words, of the clash of civilizations?
Not just acknowledge, I live that challenge every day. It does sometimes does feel like a fool's errand, almost like Sisyphus, right? Why are you doing what you're doing, right? Or not just a question for me, but for you as well, right? It's not that you go out and put out something provocative for the sake of it. It's because there is a genuine intent and genuine sort of anger and also a vision for an elevated society behind that. The forms could be different. So all of us are going through this, and I think, as Naipal said, we are a wounded civilization. I think we should acknowledge that. But does that mean that the ideas themselves do not matter? Absolutely no. And where do we draw that inspiration from when you're down and out every day, right? Because your fundamental knowledge production and knowledge dissemination systems, and by that I mean the academia, the portals of academia, and the unit in the society that has the responsibility for truth, for creating a culture of truth, you don't have access to that, right? So you are up against a mountain when you're trying to think about a different curriculum for humanities and social sciences in India. Not only is it completely warped, but it is also getting increasingly entrenched due to a variety of factors, not the least of which is a global movement against indigenous knowledge systems. So there is a tremendous challenge, and I think the first thing to do is first acknowledge that, not lose yourself and have your own fun and become stable. But the stability that I spoke about, if as an institution I am looking to impart this stability in the people, in the learners, it behoves and it's important that I first am able to deal with this in a sane manner, go about my life, and I sort of always prescribe to I think it's Fitzgerald who said, the hallmark of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold opposing ideas in the mind but still be able to function. So for me, the ability to function every day, do what you have to do while keeping the larger swan is important. But it will be foolish not to recognize the magnitude of the challenge that you are up against, and in that context, you also need to have strategy. It cannot just be effort without a direction. There's a lot of things that we've discussed with the team at Rastram, and how not just we've designed our learning method, but also the institutional collaborations that we need to have. Our scale will not come from 50 learners multiplied into 10 or 20, let's say, in the next 10 years. That is not good enough for us, although that is the primary purpose, to actually invest in people and create that leadership potential. You also need to create an ecosystem where you are creating a model of education which can then be supplied to other institutions. And if you are able to then influence and partner with other organizations to say, this is a good model for human evolution, and this is a good model to tackle the challenges that all of us face today. You cannot debate against the problem of environment. You cannot debate against the problem of xenophobia. You cannot debate against the problem of hunger. You cannot debate against the problem of inequality. These are common problems that all of us face today. We are saying Indic knowledge systems have the best potential to create minds and hearts that are able to generate solutions for this. To do that, you need institutional transmission mechanisms. They are completely disrupted. I think our travesty is that even after independence, we've not recovered them, not even an inch. So we know the challenge, but I think you go back to the conviction, and you're also inspired by people who've done it before you. We are not the first generation, who's animated by this, and in a lot of ways, we have a lot of things going for us. You and I are having this conversation. We are able to reach, all the audience that you have built through Upward and send our message. I think about Sitaram Goyalji, and I was talking to somebody else. How did they do this? How did he write? How did he index? What is that level of conviction and that level of commitment that enabled a person to to dedicate his life for that. So we, in a lot of ways, we have it easy. In a lot of ways, we also have it difficult because modern forces are also against us. But what's it without a challenge, right?
Absolutely. It's interesting that you also, in the course of this conversation, you mentioned about expansionism, right? How important do you think that is in the scheme of things? Because unless, I mean, all these ideas are brilliant. We all know, we all acknowledge these ideas. Perhaps we try and live these ideas in whatever capacity which is possible. But when we talk about the clash of civilizations again, do you think it is important for us to be expansionist in some sense and to have that conviction of spreading these ideas and spreading the way of life, the dharmic way of life, not just and not for domination as Sri Aurobindo had pointed out, but because this is what is needed in the world?
Yeah, I go back to Sri Aurobindo and Swami Vivekananda for an answer to that, right? Swami Vivekananda said, "India falls like a snow, like a dew, right? And it illuminates the world, right?" So when we talk about expansionism, clearly I think it's important to also clarify what we mean by dharmic expansionism or a civilizational nationalism, and why we think this has the solution to the problems of the world. And it's actually, once you decode it, it's fairly simple, because we think about expansionism largely in political nation state categories, because we are sort of living through a world where the political has completely submerged and subjugated the cultural and the spiritual. So we are not able to even conceive a different kind of expansionism which is elevating global consciousness. So when we say dharma, and this is where, again, going back to trading what works for what sounds good, I think we need to invert that. Dharma is the only thing that works, and it is not comfort food. It is something that gives you certain duties and creates certain constraints. And it is only when all of us are able to live within the box that dharma provides for us, and it is also the only way to elevate yourself and have a path for transcendence. And that transcendence is available for everyone in the world, because all of us are fundamentally the same source of energy if you were to believe in the Indian ontology. So when we talk about expansionism, we are talking about expanding that ontology along with the epistemology that the Indian systems give you to realize the truth. One of the challenges that we have in the Western discourse today is they have also acknowledged the void, by and large, from when I look at the sustainability discourse, or when I look at efforts like what some organizations like R3.0 are doing. They acknowledge that they don't have the metaphysical grounding to talk about why should people give up their consumption, or why should you constrain, because you have invested civilizational scale infrastructure in the aham. If you were to speak in yogic parlance, you have just amplified that dimension of human being. Now you cannot take it back, because you still need to offer something else that can produce joy. So even if you recognize the problem, you do not have the means to solve that problem. So when we say expansionism, the Indian expansionism, it is for the world to actually have a different definition of joy that can help all of us sustain. Because when the climate disaster strikes, it doesn't respect nation state boundaries. When ecological disaster looms large, you cannot be within the bilateral or multilateral framework that you've given yourself, right? So this is, we are actively hurtling towards a civilizational collapse at a global scale. So when we talk about dharmic expansionism, the moral case for dharmic expansionism is that it is the framework that can solve the conundrum and the sort of complete chaos that we find ourselves in, right? So Indian expansionism will always be about elevating global consciousness, and as inheritors of this civilization, if we are not able to represent that confidently, and if we are not able to take on the world, look at the world in their eye and say, this is a void that we need to fill, and if we are always going to live our lives through the script that somebody else has given us, we will not just underserve ourselves, but will actually also play a role in accelerating the demise.
Right. So how important do you think it is for the state to embrace that identity then? I mean, do you think it is even possible to speak about these things? Of course, it is possible to speak, but to implement these things, given that we live in a secular republic, which does not even acknowledge that it has a civilizational responsibility to fulfill.
Yeah. At Rastram, our vision is to see a dharmic polity, right? And we don't say that lightly. There is a responsibility when you introduce a term like this to explain, to give examples, to try and illustrate how this is going to work. And there is tremendous amount of academic, cultural, media work that needs to happen to generate consciousness around this. Yes, no, state is not going to come up because the political incentives are completely against it. In fact, it is going very quickly down the other path, right? We don't suffer any illusion that the state is suddenly going to take up a different moral discourse. But the possibility of that comes from the confidence that the people in this land have always paid attention to a dharmic cause. If you are able to create, in market speak, if you are able to create a demand side intervention, if you are able to change the discourse from the excessively political to the cultural and the spiritual, and if people start consuming more culture, Indic culture and Indic spiritual experiences, can that become a political issue? Can you, in fact, we just launched the Center for Cultural Leadership this week, and one of the vision statements that we have for that is, can you create 700 cultural curators who are able to work in their local constituencies, document all the cultural artifacts of that region, create a policy agenda out of it, and work with the political leaders to generate a political purchase for that? It could be an individual leader, it could be a party ideology, but can we create some sort of currency for cultural and spiritual issues, which the politics will then respond to? I think it's a question of what incentives we create and how the political class responds to that. But beyond that, the route, the path to that, the reason why Rastram is an academic institution and not any other form, apart from the fact that we have certain competencies within that, is that you need to append what goes as education today. At least in my mind, it's very clear that all of these efforts go back to primary school curriculum. We are starting with the higher education, and it's tremendously important that we try and at least have a vision of an alternate there, but it has to very quickly in the next generation go down to school curriculum. If we've had the best meditation on human development, and if we are not giving that to our children, then we are failed civilization already.
So one of the challenges that I face when I am in discussions of this kind is that because we are speaking in a language that comes from outside, right? So the paradigms itself are different. So for example, you quoted Sowell. So Sowell says that there's worldview, then it translates to ideology, that translates to policy, and the policy needs to be activated through a bunch of institutions. So that's the cascade that is followed. But at a philosophical level, there are scholars who will say that the Indian civilization does not really have a worldview, because, like S.N. Balagangadhar says. But I don't want to talk about that because that gets too dense, right? What I would like you to comment on is, if possible, give me 3 or a couple of concrete instances where influence on public policy will have a real-term change in how India is placed in the world and how the Indian people are empowered. And by extension, the planet is a better place to live in.
No, it goes back to the two main issues, and you are much better placed to understand this than many others because you are in the thick of this action. One is temples, because we spoke about institutional transmission mechanisms. Temple for us was not just a sacred space, that was the space where you generated knowledge. Every single thing that I've spoken about as a structure of knowledge and a culture that was informed by that knowledge, the holding space for that was the temple. So the first intervention that needs to happen is that the state needs to get out of the temples. And you guys are running a fantastic campaign. I don't need to preach to the choir, but if you are able to just take care of that, give it back to the community, and the community is able to devise its own mechanisms for producing and disseminating knowledge, then in fact a lot of these things will automatically get resolved within a couple of generations. That's my personal view. So I think the first intervention that needs to happen, and even if the political incentive is against that today, if you really want a civilizational advance, you need to give back the mechanism for that, the whole structure that the society has created for that. And the second one critically is education, right? I think they are interlinked as well. But within education, the primary school education is very important. We are not allowed at this time to think about Indic knowledge system based education as a primary tool for training our children. And I'm talking about Kantastha, I'm talking about logic, I'm talking about Sanskrit as a language which is able to expand your neural capacity. We need to shy away, or we need to get away from this burden that we are carrying of a colonial education system, and start thinking about IKS not as an alternative but as the mainstream and the de facto education model in this country. And you can have a very, very reasonable debate around what should that synthesis look like. It does not mean that we are turning away from all the advances of modern education system. There is a great synthesis possible, but you develop that critical reserve to look at everything, every idea that comes to you, and decide what idea fits into your scheme of things. So temples and education is clearly the two main areas of public policy advocacy for anybody who believes in the civilizational cause for the next decade or two. For that, of course, we need to create the curriculum, right? We need to make sure that there is a graded way of helping our children go through that knowledge system. We need to also examine which part of our structure of knowledge system needs to be introduced at what level. So that is an academic work, right? And there is tremendous social work that needs to happen to convince people that this is the right way for their children to be educated. So temples and education, in my mind, hold the key for whatever renaissance that we're talking about.
Right, again, but I think that this sort of approach actually gives the state a free pass, because then it, I mean, rightly or wrongly, but it puts the onus of the change on the common man. But the state, being what it is in the current world, is tremendously powerful, and it also represents the common man in the world forums. For example, in the case of my own community, we were kicked out of the valley in 1990. Everyone knows about it. But the Indian state has never actually acknowledged that fact that it was the Hindus who were kicked out because they were, in the midst of an intolerant religious majority, and that there is a religious, it's not a political problem, but a religious and civilizational problem, as we keep repeating nowadays. So, if we put the onus on the individual, then we lose the power of the state itself. It's interesting you mentioned the case of freedom of temples. In my opinion, and at Upward, at Indic Collective, we've been championing the case for freedom of temples. But in my personal opinion, and I'll stick my neck out here and say that the ideal situation for a temple is to be managed by a state, but that state has to be a Hindu state, like it used to happen all the time. Because there are so many issues with temple management that only an organized entity and a big entity like the state can do, which is not possible for a community. So I think the very first step has to be to pressurize, or to, in whatever way, to force the state to acknowledge its civilizational responsibility and become a civilizational state. Now, why I'm saying all this is because I would like to hear your views on what that civilizational state would be. I think you've touched upon it a little bit, but how does that differ from an ethno-state? Because we are speaking in a paradigm which is...
No, that is, I agree with you, right? We might be shortchanging ourselves if we shift the onus to society, which then sort of descends down to an individual level. We need to interrogate state action, state power, and utilize the state power for civilizational cause. I'm totally with you on that. I don't have tremendous confidence with the political structure and the constitution that we've given ourselves that this can happen within the confines of that. I know a lot of people, including some of JSD and others, are trying to make an argument for civilizational state from within the interpretive possibilities of constitution. My personal view is that that is not going to be possible. So if you want to start with that, and this is the second order work that we need to do. The challenge, I think, is what comes first. Do you first generate that consciousness in people which then sort of determines their own constitution, or do you change the instrumentality of the constitution itself? Then the state becomes acting as an agent according to that constitution. I think we can debate on what's a good strategy. I think it's more of a strategy because the aim is not different. Ultimately, the aim is that there is a flowering of the mind. And at Rashtam, we've thought about it in three dimensions. What are the fundamental concerns of any nation? Identity, stability, and prosperity. If you follow a certain school of thought today, they will tell you that if you are able to become prosperous, then your identity question gets resolved. I do not agree with that, and I think we have a fundamental problem there because we've inverted that sequence and that flow. We will have to resolve the identity question first. We are not able to get the full power of our national velocity behind us in any sphere. It could be the culture sphere, it could be the economic sphere, it could be the strategic sphere, it could even be a way to think about Indian expansionism itself. We are not able to think about that because we are still not clear about our identity. The fact that our core is a Hindu civilization, and that civilization by itself is not exclusivist. So there is a moral claim to actually have a Hindu Rashtra. We should not be apologetic about it. I think maybe there should be a parallel approach where we are, and this is something that can happen through advocacy and intellectual thought building. In fact, it's interesting that you bring it up because we are currently in the process of discussing the prospect of a series of books on this very idea, because there needs to be a theory building around it. There needs to be first some sort of doctrinal power which is then able to tell you why this is an ideal state formation. Right? I left it at that because that's not a short-term thing in my view. In the next generation, when I said in the next 5 to 10 years, there has to be, I think, a two-pronged strategy. There needs to be a constant building up of pressure on what we are doing, right? What you guys at Upward are doing around the Hindu temple mobilization. Simultaneously, there also needs to be significant thought building around what is the roadmap for a Dharmarajya. Some of our thinkers have already started articulating it, and if you follow the social media discourse, and it's interesting that it has come from social media and not from academia, and that is instructive. What needs to happen is that this needs to come from the portals of academia. This needs to become not a narrative but a discourse, right? So I think those two things need to happen simultaneously. Where you start depends on where you are. I am in an academic setup where I can influence learning outcomes for a set of people. I am in a space which can generate research, scrutinize state actions and give some policy prescriptions, but I do not have any illusion that that will immediately change it. Over a period of time, you need to work also on the demand side. Right? If we are going to allow ourselves to be fractured on questions of identity forever, we are going to transfer the agency of the community to the political class always. How do you arrest that? Right? So I think there needs to be action on both sides, and there needs to be maybe a concerted, strategic, collaborative sort of action on this, not just one dimension.
So theoretically, I understand that there is, there'll always be debate about what takes priority, whether we should first go with the state, pressurize the state, or whether we should build a societal discourse on these things. But to me personally, I think when I think about these things, I don't know. There is a sense of urgency within me, because I believe that even the question of priorities, what we should do first, could cost us the civilization, because we're in that state. We've come out of 800 or so years of colonization, and it's not been an easy journey. And now that we are trying to rebuild the civilization, it's obviously, one, it is not easy, but secondly, we are rebuilding from scratch. And the forces are aligned so much against us in this globalized world that if we take one step wrong, it could all be over. Consider the fact that, the Indian government itself outsources most of its thinking as well as execution work to either global policy think tanks or the execution work to these NGOs, right? Recently, I was speaking to someone. He mentioned that there is a lot of work going on in the sanitation and waterworks area, and he was working in one of those NGOs, one of my neighbors. And just on a little bit of inquiry, I figured that this was an organization aligned with World Vision, and they were also following that evangelical agenda. And the person who was working was, of course, not aware of all that, right? So it's happening every single day, and we as a people, as a collective, Hindus are nowhere, because these think tanks, these NGOs, they go back to the colonial period, and some of them are more than 100 years old, right? And they've been at it for some time. while we are still contemplating on what to do. So, the gap is so much. Now, what do you make of all that, right? For example, the Brookings Institute, right? It is funded by forces who are not particularly kind to India. There is the global Islamist forces and stuff like that. And it's a well-known fact that where their money comes from, what their agenda is. And they are invited by the government of India to conduct election research and to inform all kinds of policy making, stuff like that. And in this world where our own sovereignty is in question, where do we start? And I mean, I know it's a vague question, but I would just like your thoughts on these.
No, firstly, I think the danger that you mentioned, it's something that all of us need to recognize, the immediacy of it. We do not have the luxury of time, and this is a personal realization that has helped me move away from what I was doing to do what I'm doing now. We might be lulled into complacency because on the surface nothing is changing, but beneath the surface, and I think it's now not just beneath the surface, it's out there in the open. Your demographics are challenged, your territory is challenged, your identity is challenged, your way of life is challenged, and we need to recognize the range of forces that we are against. There is, of course, the Abrahamic assault on Indian culture. There is also the attack of modernity itself. Ashay Naik writes about it, and he categorizes the Indian response into three, the Indic response into three sort of dimensions. Even a lot of people who profess an affinity towards Indic culture have also internalized the liberal values. The power of the discourse is such that we are all speaking from that categories. We've internalized it so much that we are not able to have an alternative imagination. So you do not even, this whole notion of Hindus in idea only, or he knows, or whatever, that is a real danger as well. The other sort of global force that's aligned against you is precisely the power of the global elite through these foundations that you mentioned. And I've been reading a bit about it, Ashish, and it's you can admire their strategic nous because they've created the entire idea of the sovereign individual itself as a category, because when they realized that colonialism in its old imperialistic form was no longer tenable because of historical outputs, they needed some other tools or some other sort of mechanism to still further their agenda. So these are supra governments. This is the global elite that is governing this. And unfortunately, because of the situation that a lot of Indians find themselves in, on one hand, completely being unaware of these dangers because of a completely misleading education system, and on the other hand, the need to have some semblance of a career. You get up and there is a moral course given to you, and some sort of idea that you're working in sanitation, you're working in sustainable development goals, you're working in some other public interest or a public good issue. You do not have the time or the intelligence anymore to examine the second order, third order consequences of this, and what is the capital infusion structure like. This is a big challenge, and the response has to come institutionally. If you are still thinking, and I agree with you, if we do not wake up and act on it now, within a generation we are going to lose this battle. We have already. Some of the things that were a taboo even 20 years ago have become mainstream discourse, and this is exactly what I mean, that I don't want my kid to wake up and start accepting what I think are dangerous ideas for our sustainability. Right? This is a very deeply personal battle, and I think this battle is not just my personal one, it's actually every Hindu parent's battle, and we need to rise up. But the response has to be institutional and strategic, and we'll need to learn and examine the sort of tools that have been devised by the global elite to do that. Why do not, why is it that we don't have an India Studies Center in 80 countries across the world? Why is it that we don't have the equivalent of Al Jazeera broadcasting what is the Indian national civilizational interest? Why is it that our media studies curriculum in India is still not embedded in the civilizational ethos? So we have fundamental problems if we do not recognize this and provide an institutional response. And this is really the impulse that animates us at Rastram, that we need to have a Hindu institutional Indic response to the challenges that we are seeing all around us. I agree with you. It's a battle that's going to take us at least in the next 20-30 years, but any single misstep here can potentially just not just defer, but actually completely decimate any possibility of a renaissance itself.
it was lovely speaking with you. I think this is, I mean, like most Upward videos, this leaves us on a note of ponderance and thinking, and the issue is not resolved. You know, a lot of our viewers always complain, where is the solution? But I think the solution lies in these conversations, and of course, translating the conversations into action, which you guys are doing at Rashtraam. I would urge the viewers to have a look at the work that Rashtraam is doing. Please visit www.rashtram.org, and if you are in that phase of life where you're looking to take up more responsibility and develop your career in a certain direction of nation building, then I think Rashtraam is the place for you. Please do have a look and enroll if you like what you see. Thank you, Raghav, and we'll probably meet again and explore these ideas further.
Thank you so much, Ashish, for having me, and enjoy the conversation. Thank you, as always.